Welcome to another episode of The Inquisitive Analyst. I'm your host, Marcus Utikang. It's the show where we chat about business analysis and project management and the challenges and triumphs within those fields. It's inspiring, informative, and very much inquisitive. My guest today is a lead consultant developing BPM capabilities. He built Chevron's Business Process Management Foundation from 2005 to 2010. He's also a speaker and author of many BPM articles and the book BPM Boots on the Ground. Please help me welcome to today's show, joining us all the way from California, Jim Boots. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Marcus. Great to be here.
You're welcome. Now, perhaps we can start. Today, we want to look a bit at business process modeling, which I don't have a lot of on my show. And that's something that many business analysts are heavily involved in. So maybe we can start off by asking, how did you get started in enterprise architecture and as a BPM advisor?
Yeah, great question. As you can tell, I have gray hair and I've been around a long time. So my journey, I guess you could describe as decades long. Going back to the 80s, I was tapped as a total quality management kind of lead person for a division of Chevron Chemical back then. And we were following W. Edwards Deming's approach to total quality management. I had the great fortune of getting to go see him at some conferences when he was still alive back in those days. And that's when we started taking on lots of the tools, statistical process control, histograms, flowcharts, all that kind of thing, and Pareto diagrams, so forth. I did some teaching of people around those sorts of things. So that was my first introduction really to the idea of how everything comes together, how the information flows through the organization based on the work that people do. And then, I kind of had the good fortune of going back and forth between jobs kind of like that and functional jobs. So I could get deeply into an area and then see how they connect. So in the 90s, I was involved in supply chain management. Once again, very process oriented, lots of different areas that I was helping to develop for Chevron Chemical at that time. Then I went into business management for a while for a polyethylene business, and that had all the functions reporting to me, which again was very interesting, seeing how they all come together. Rather than having everyone working in silos, how do you get them cooperating and getting things flowing smoothly? In the early 2000s, Chevron started an operational excellence initiative, and I happened to be the first so-called operational excellence champion at Chevron. And that was very process oriented again, really driving safety, reliability, that sort of thing. I wound up in a health, environment, and safety manager job early in 2000s as well. And it was during that time I had a lot of responsibilities for different safety type processes. You can imagine lots of different things. And so I was looking around and said, well, we can do Visio diagrams. They're okay, but they're not integrated. There's no overall view. And so I found a good software product at that time. And that really caught my attention. And I said, boy, I really like this. I think this can have a very powerful effect on people. And I gradually realized this was going to be a cornerstone for real BPM maturity. Business process management is what I mean when I say BPM. And so I kind of became kind of the guru inside Chevron, for lack of a better word, around the use of that tool, how to integrate it into operating companies. And so I became an internal advisor on that. And by 2010, I said, I want to do this as a career. And I left Chevron and became a consultant at that time. Actually wound up working for Chevron as a consultant for a while too, but I've had some other clients since then. So that's my journey up to this point.
So why is BPM so important for organizations and also for business analysts?
Yeah, great question. It's kind of a trick question in a way, because if you look around and look at companies across the world, most of them are not very mature in business process management. So there's a gap between, how important they treat it and how important they probably should treat it in terms of the value that it can return. So I would say most organizations are at a level 2 maturity, and they're, what they really do in most cases, they may have some manuals, some guidance and so forth, but mostly they just try to hire really smart people, say, go work in this area and figure out how to deliver what we want you to produce. And they may, talk to other people and so forth. But, that's not a very effective way ultimately to really drive consistency and efficiency, reliability. Things tend to fall between the cracks, no matter how good the intentions of people are. And people's intentions are almost always good, frankly. People want to do a good job. So a much better approach in why it's important for business analysts is to say, hey, why don't we get our act together and make sure we talk to people, figure out what a good way to do it is. Let's call it a best practice. And let's all consistently do it that way. And then, you start to get very reliable outcomes and so forth. So that's why it's important. Again, I think it's really underutilized in terms of what can be done with it to add value.
I like that idea of best practices. That's always, but of course, sometimes these things can get complicated. And in reference to BPM itself, you say that if your model becomes complicated and starts to look like an electrical diagram, then you've probably lost people. With best practices aside, and in reference to this quote, maybe you can elaborate a bit on that quote.
Yeah, it's a good point. First, let's distinguish between the kinds of processes that we're interested in from a business analyst point of view. What gets a lot of attention these days are automated processes, so workflow type things. Yeah. And certainly, organizations like banks, for example, they have lots of things like that. It's very transactional oriented. But in most organizations, the vast majority of processes are human centric. They may use tools in that process, but it's people doing things and ultimately producing information they're sharing with other people in most cases. So if you're making things that are going to be relatable to people, you want something that really is very intuitive. And, kind of the approach that you can take with good software is a hierarchical approach. So you don't have to jam every idea onto one diagram with 50 boxes and arrows going everywhere. You try to get the high level view, and then you can drill down or decompose into the details. And people think that way more naturally. Most people do. They want to see the big picture. They want to see the forest before they get deeply into the trees. Yeah. And so that's what I really believe in. And it's a big part of my approach is to say this really should be about empowering people. And so if they're intimidated by the diagrams, you've already kind of lost their hearts and souls at that point.
Yeah, no, that's true. I like this idea of drilling down, and UPN certainly speaks to that too. And in project management, we talk about work breakdown structures. Again, it's all about drilling down to the smallest component of work, so you can, start from the small and go up, like you said, hierarchical, right? So
yes.
Now, your book, BPM Boots on the Ground, obviously a play on your name, your last name. And now that's about how to implement strategic business process management. And in your book, you provide lessons learned from one of the world's largest organizations that you worked with. Maybe you can provide us with some lessons learned that we can take away.
Sure. There's so many, but let me boil it down to three key ones. And again, distinguishing between strategic business process management and tactical. Lots of organizations do a reasonably good job at tactical process management, process improvement. You've certainly heard of Lean Six Sigma. That can be very extensive or it can be rather minimal, but it tends to be tactical improvements. Hey, here's an area we go in, we want to make things better, reduce, scrap or waste or whatever. And that's okay. But if you really want an organization to embrace a process approach from management on down, then there are really three key things. And the first one is, it's just the main thing is you got to have top management support. That really needs to be long-term support because it doesn't happen overnight where the organization moves up from a level 2 to a level 4 or 5 on their maturity scale. So that's tough, but that's really what you need. And I have the luxury these days with my business that I say no if I don't really think that the top management team is on board with it and really committed to it, because I know they'll just waste time and money. So that's one. You got to have that top management. Without that, you're probably not going to do strategic process management. You might be able to get an example and convince people that, oh, this is really good, and then they get excited. That's rare. It's possible, but rare. So I'm typically looking for organizations where the leaders kind of come to me. They realize that this is important. They have a certain passion for it. And then I'm ready to work with them. All right. Number two is the idea, I mentioned it, of having an employee empowerment approach. It should not feel to people like you're going in and you're trying to automate everything or reduce my job to something, minimal. I mean, most people have fairly complex jobs these days that take a lot of things into account. But if you approach it that, hey, we know you have the knowledge. No one else has the knowledge. Your group, the people you work with, you know how it goes. And then you sit with those people, with the subject matter experts. You ask them questions. You draw the diagrams as they give the answers to those questions. And guess what? The light bulbs go on. They start seeing, they get very enthusiastic. Hey, I'm really proud of the work I do. And when you start to get that happening, you're really beginning to get it down into the cultural roots. The last thing I'll say is the third thing is this idea of a tangible thing. And it's tangible, okay, it's really inside a computer, so it's not tangible, but it's visible, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of a complete process architecture from the top down. So when I work with an organization, the first thing we do is we try to lay out the top view of all the processes in the organization. Now you say, oh, how many is that? Well, it's probably only about 15 or so. Actually, you have a few management processes, things around developing vision and strategy, developing a business plan, monitoring and reinforcing and adjusting, and kind of reviewing the whole system. You have all your support processes, which are things like IT and finance and HR and so forth. And then you have your core processes, your value chain, and that's unique to every organization to some degree, but you can describe things at a very high level. So even a large organization like I worked in at Chevron, really you can describe the value chain almost in 5 steps. You got to find the petroleum, you got to get it out of the ground, you got to ship it, you got to refine it, and you got to sell the products that you make. You can start from there, then you drill down as far down as you need to, as many levels until you get to the task level. So I really have come to be a believer that without that thing that you can look at and talk with other people about, you're really just talking in the air, and and it doesn't really necessarily ever connect. So that's my approach as a consultant. I just don't do process work without the idea of we're going to build a complete process architecture for you.
It's interesting you mentioned Chevron. Chevron is here in Calgary. In fact, when you go to the Chevron building, there is a plaque downstairs in the main foyer that explains the history of Chevron. Turns out it's an American from the States who came up to Calgary to open up the Calgary version of Chevron. So there's an interesting historic point about Chevron for you. On the topic of strategy, I was going to ask, and you say that if you don't get executive buy-in, right, you're not going to implement your BPM plans. So what are a few good ways to sell BPM in organizations? I mean, how do we get executives to understand BPM and to commit to implementing it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really is. So maybe the easiest way, but never the situation you want to be in, is the burning platform. Mm-hmm. That, boy, we have a major problem here. We better figure out how to get our processes under control. Unfortunately, it doesn't always result in management committing to, let's really work out the details and figure out how to do this thing well. But they may get that insight, or they may come under pressure to do that. Another way, if you're internal to an organization, is if you can prove out some things, then show them, hey, look what we did here by putting together some of our process diagrams, sorting out who does what, getting clear about this. They may start to get enthusiastic and say, well, maybe we build on that. And I would always take an approach that's kind of, let's start with maybe a proof of concept, a couple of weeks, then a pilot, maybe 6 weeks, and so that they realize, okay, we can do this in increments before we make the big commitment. But, I mean, in the end, the truth of the matter is I don't even really think about making pitches to to leaders who don't already have some passion around the need to sort this out, because for whatever reason, and I can't explain exactly, but sometimes I think, especially in large corporations, some of the higher level managers, it's been so long since they've been down in the trenches and actually done, let's call it real work. They kind of don't realize how important it is to get all these things straight. So it's a tough nut. That's the hardest thing about BPM. And I think why it probably isn't as widespread as it is just a lot of managers don't quite understand the importance of it.
Yeah, getting that message across is really important. Now, you say that management should push strategy down into operational details, like you've explained a bit. How is it that process management is essential to good execution of strategies?
Yeah, I mean, in a very general sense, I think most people would probably agree, although we could get into definitions, but strategy is kind of the very highest level statement of how you're going to do something. You've got your objectives. This is what we want to accomplish. And strategy says something about how you're going to get there. So it's kind of the parent of processes. It's saying, okay, well, let's take an example. Let's say we want to introduce a new product into an existing market that we have. Well, that's probably going to involve, all kinds of testing of the new product with customers. You're going to do competitive analysis around that, and so on and so forth, research perhaps. Well, there's a lot of process there. And if you actually expect to succeed with your strategy, you probably want to sort out who's going to do what to make all that come together. And certainly, I mean, if you want to achieve operational excellence, then, it's just, it applies to all processes. Now, one of the things, what I say about business process management, business is about priorities, it's about profits, that kind of thing. So it doesn't mean you're going to spend a lot of time figuring out how to run the fax machine. Everyone knows how to do that fax machine. That's dated, right? Or the copy machine. So you do prioritize and you start with the things that are really important. Where are we having problems? Are we having problems with regulators, with clients? What is it? Let's get in there and start sorting things out. Then we get some success. Then maybe we have some momentum starting to build.
I like that, building the steps up. Now, sometimes, and you've alluded to what I'm going to explain a bit, sometimes a consultant may be working, say, on a BPM process, with the intention they're trying to implement cost reduction, for example, right? Maybe that's the purpose. And an employee may be very resistant to making processes work better. I know in my experience, you come in to try and implement a process and nobody wants to give you the information that you're looking for. So how can we make processes work better if the end result might be that this employee thinks they're going to lose their job? So what are some good solutions to build employee enthusiasm in order to successfully implement that BPM across the workforce?
Yeah, that is a tough one, because really, the idea that you might lose your job kind of undermines the whole idea of empowered employees, right? You're not only not empowered, you don't even have a job. And if you foresee that coming, you're going to be very perhaps skeptical. So I think in that situation, I mean, fortunately, I haven't had to work in that situation, so I don't have a great amount of experience in it. But if I were, convinced that it made sense to do it, I think you probably need some artificial incentives. You have to say, okay, yeah, this is where we're going. It's a change in the world, and we're going to pay you extra for doing this kind of work, or something, some sort of awards for recognition, probably more than recognition. Typically at that point, people are worried about, where am I going to get my income? So a little extra money might give them the incentive to make that effort. I don't have any other great solutions on that. That's a tough one.
No, that's cool. Another one I was going to add to that is giving them, allowing them to understand that this is making their job more efficient, so they can move on to bigger things. That's one. I don't know. It doesn't always work, like you said, but it certainly is one suggestion. Now, what are some aspects of deploying and adopting BPM into an organization? What are some of the steps that you take to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, really, what I tend to describe to my clients is that we're going to go through a period of time where we begin to build out your process architecture. And again, we want to focus on the areas that are most important to you from a business point of view. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to meet with the employees, and it can be online, frankly. I mean, these tools work very well. And, I just talk, I ask a lot of questions, and they see the diagrams come together as we do it. And typically it's an hour and a half, 2-hour meeting at a time. And, maybe I'll have 10 of those over the course of a week as we begin to build out the architecture. And then over a period of few months, you kind of build it all out. But as you build an area out, you can say, okay, this area is ready for deployment, so to speak, where you say, all right, now we're going to have at least one of the people who we worked with, the subject matter experts, and they're going to become a process advisor. That's the terminology I use with my clients. And what that means is they're going to represent that process to the work group that they're in and make sure that everyone understands it, that it's as good as it can possibly be to help them do their jobs, and to be responsive, to say, oh, if something isn't working all that great, let's sit down and figure it out and work with whoever the process mapper is to get it right. So that's the beginning of the deployment, and then to really begin to drill it into the culture. That's a bad word, but to nurture it into the culture is to have the leaders start to change their behaviors a little bit. And it's not terribly complicated, but a good leader in that circumstance where you're trying to get BPM to take hold is going to say, oh, we had a problem. And what they're not going to do is try to blame someone. I mean, in fact, they're going to put that in the past, and they're going to say, let's get out our process diagrams and let's go in there and see if we can figure out where things went off track. Or if we didn't realize that there was some requirement that we haven't built into our process yet. And so it becomes a problem-solving approach for everybody, but the team seeing the leader rely on that documentation really sends a message. And the way that you do that as a leader is very important for reinforcing the organization that this is going to be a key cultural artifact for us that we're going to refer to all the time. And then you take it the next step. Okay, great. We see that there's an opportunity for improvement. Maybe it's easy. Maybe it's complicated. If it's easy, you just make the change. If it's complicated, you put together a little process improvement team. You make the changes, and then you use the tool to deploy those changes too. Say, okay, people, we're going to sit down and talk about the changes we made. Does everyone understand? Good. Maybe you have a little sign off or something like that. But now that map, those diagrams are deployed to that part of the organization. And then you just continue to do that. You roll that out across the organization with process advisors in each area, someone who's going to sustain it. And that's the key word. It's got to be dynamic. As soon as unfortunately, a lot of the big consulting firms, they're great at going in and fixing things, but they don't really leave internal capability. So it just sits there. In 6 months, it starts to lose its relevance, if not sooner. And pretty soon, no one's referring to the diagrams anymore. So it's the internal support of the use of those diagrams and making sure they stay up to date that really starts to make it meaningful.
So you've got the adoption. People are adopting it. How do you build those internal capabilities for the client to the point where they can continue without the need for the consultant after adoption?
Yeah. And almost every organization I would recommend that they have a consultant to begin with. It just because there are enough parts of this that it's not going to be obvious to most people. But I would put it in 2 categories then. Again, the simple one is the diagrams, but then you've got the people side. So I mentioned the process advisors. They become a key element of that. And it's probably only 5% of their time or less. I mean, they're doing their work, but they also are being stewards over this diagram. So that's one piece. You're going to probably have someone, whatever the title, something like BPM coordinator or BPM champion or something, who oversees all those process advisors, gives them a forum to exchange ideas, make sure they have access to people who know how to manipulate the tools. They don't all need to learn how to use the software. But then that's the third role, is someone, whether it's the BPM coordinator or another person who becomes at least a reasonable expert in the use of the tool, so that they can quickly make changes based on what people are saying that needs to be done. Now, in my approach, I've found that the mapping exercise itself is not a simple thing, because you got to move between big picture and details very fluidly. People don't all do that necessarily. So as the person doing it, you've got to guide them to say, okay, let's get a little higher level on these things. Then we'll drill down into the details in the next level. But at least you can build some internal capability. Once you have all the diagrams, then it tends to be more incremental changes. And a lot of people can learn how to do that. And so, typically I'll say we need at least 2 people internally who know how to use the tool, so that in the future, changes that are needed can be made without you having to come to me all the time. And then I'll just I'll cycle back around and say, you also probably need some sort of high-level sponsor. You can call him a BPM sponsor or whatever, who is making sure that all these people are doing their jobs, that the BPM coordinator is reporting to the management team on the progress around all this stuff. And they're removing obstacles to make sure the initiative is continuing. And again, I've really never seen it being less than about 3 years for an organization to get, from say a level 2 up to a level 4 or so on a 5-point scale. So it just takes a while. And it takes a while to do the diagrams, to teach people, to get them used to it, and to push it into the culture. So you need that top management consistency to make sure that it's reinforced in the organization.
Yeah, definitely. That top down is very important. And it's interesting you mentioned 2 people or 3 people to support the group. And I remember back, just in my experience, maybe they'll say 5 people are going to be trained on this, and in the end, it's only 1 or 2 people who end up using it. And I just bring that up. It's an experience that I found. So you make sure, at least myself as a business analyst, I always make sure that I was that 1 or 2 person, 1 or 2 people involved, and really, because then you're needed, right? When things change, and you can say, hey, do you want to keep me? Or do you want to,
yeah, right.
So
that's exactly right.
Yeah, that's how it works. What's your advice to people wanting to get into BPM? Any advice on lessons learned, or any takeaways, or any steps that they can take to get into BPM?
Sure. Reading books is always a good idea if you're a reader. There are lots of good books out there. And you can go all the way back to Deming, and before that, Rumler Braish in the 90s. They had their seminal book. One of my favorites is Paul Harmon. He has a book, I think it's called Process Change, or Business Process Change. That I kind of thought that it was my Bible early on. I have my book. I think it's got a lot of practical advice that I think people could probably pick up a lot of stuff. That's one aspect. Certainly articles out there, your podcasts, but BP Trends, an organization, bptrends.com publishes a lot of current articles that are quite good. There are seminars out there too. I assume we'll all get back to actually attending some things in person eventually. And you can pick up some good things from there. And there's nothing like just playing around with stuff yourself and, just saying, this looks interesting. Let me see what I can do on my free time, and then show it to my manager, and maybe I can get them excited. So
nice. Sometimes I've tried to devote half an hour a day to reading on something, and it turns out to be an hour and a half. I got to do it every second day instead, or something like that. Yeah, that's a great way of doing it. Well, thanks very much, Jim. It's been a pleasure listening to you. You've got certainly a long, many years of experience, and I think the audience is able to glean a lot from what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. And if anyone would like to, ask any more questions, they can feel free to contact me. My email is jimboots.gpi@gmail.com. Okay. Yeah, GPI stands for my company name, Global Process Innovation. But yeah, just all Jim Boots, one word, .gpi@gmail.com.
And you're on LinkedIn?
I am on LinkedIn. Yeah, people can find me there too.
And what about, you have a website?
I do. It's called globalprocessinnovation.com,
Okay.
all one word. And
Yeah.
you can see a little bit about my profile and some other things on there. And you can contact me through that as well.
That's right. Fantastic. Well, thanks. Thanks for coming on board, Jim. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Marcus. A pleasure.
You're welcome. Have yourself a great day.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.